Hello, viewer. I'm very excited to be inviting you in on the project Spectrum. This is a summer project, it's ongoing, and I hope to invite you into an inside look on how we have moved through the development process, the game development process, from character design to world building to the game flow. I want to tackle each of these subjects in this video to sort of give you a overarching view of what happens when you build a game from scratch with a small team. So my friend came to me and he was really interested in building a title that would be relatively simple as far as the mechanic is concerned. And when I say mechanic, that's what your player is doing to sort of progress in the game. And at the time we were playing a title by the name of Soda Dungeon, and it was absolutely hilarious and adorable. And it's this sort of game where, and I'll go ahead and show you this. This is a game where you're in a sort of bar and you're purchasing sodas, and based on those sodas you get different characters that have different powers, and you go throughout these sequences of dungeons and you fight things, and this can either automate or you can tap the screen to attack, and you get different loot or different objects that you can use to progress. So it's a relatively simple idea, and you can add as much complexity and interesting narrative or layer interesting narrative onto it. So we started here, and from that point we began to think about what different narratives we could attach to this particular mechanic. So as I always do when I'm working with an idea, I go right to my sketchbook and I start thinking about what sort of characters or worlds, or even I just start writing down a summary of what might become a guiding theme in our game. So when I started to sketch some things out, originally we got stuck on this idea of like a cyberpunk culture, Matrix type android cyborgs narrative, and what happened was I was spending a lot of time thinking about the characters and how I would render the characters and how much time that would take, and there's two of us and we have so much other stuff to do. So I ended up rendering our characters down to these like bytes. I'll put pictures on the screen because you might not be able to see that too well. But I came up with this idea of these bytes, and these would be like almost like computer bytes, and bytes is kind of like a term that you would associate with like the computer world. And these are sort of little geometric dudes, and they would sort of look relatively simplified, but have accents on them that might indicate circuitry or things like that. And so I just sat in my sketchbook, went out to the park, went for a walk, and started just like drawing these geometric shapes and the things that would be onto them. And they weren't, and these are just very quick sketches. And I wasn't so concerned about detail. I wanted to figure out simplicity, but still little bits and pieces of visuals that would tie into the theme. So as I started to walk around and think about this, I pivoted and began to look at things, and I was really interested at the time to come up with maybe a game that would explore color theory, which is, very, very, very in depth and complicated, and I wanted to take more of a simplified approach to experimenting with color theory. So I went into this idea about spectrum, which is where spectrum came from. It's this world where you have hues, or your colors, versus your tints and your shades, because I always loved those exercises in art school. I like to work with colors, and they're very complex, and I just love working with those in general, just kind of experimenting with color. So here came the idea of coming up with, instead of these little cyborg bytes, why not make these colorful and exquisite hues that would be these geometric shapes, but would be vibrant and unique in their color. So this is where we took our major pivot in our theme and our story, and we went from cyberpunk android cyborg to color theory spectrum, and trying to figure out what the character design, the world, while maintaining the mechanic, what would be that shift? So I'm going to show you a little bit of how the character development evolved from sketchbook, from concept and conversation to actual development. So thank you for watching. Alright, so from this point forward, I'm going to try to be concise, because I just want to give you a glimpse on what goes on in the development stages. So this is character development, right? And when I'm sketching this out in my sketchbook, I realize that there's a certain limitation that I have in my ability to render these geometric characters to satisfactory, to some sort of satisfaction of my own as a designer. So one of the things that I really like to do is I like to build things dimensionally. Usually I like to work in clay. And build up from there, but this was an opportunity to jump into a 3D modeling program called Maya, which I have pretty decent amount of experience in, and I hadn't been using it for a while, so this was an excuse to jump back into Maya and build things. So I started to put these characters together, and you can notice that they're pretty simplified, right? But they've got a little bit of character. They're kind of interesting to look at. Right now they're not so interesting because they're not colorful, or they're, you know, they're sort of hard to kind of see. But this is them in their early stages. And what I would do, or what I do, is I build these guys, and I go ahead and I render. I get some sort of render of them to figure out what they're going to look like, what perspective they're going to be, what colors they're going to be. And this program allows me to experiment with that very quickly, actually. You can just build them, you can rotate them, you can put a camera into your scene, and you can sort of figure out what angle you're going to look at these characters from. Now, when I created this character, there's a process of flattening this down to what's called a UV map, that is like a 2D image of like a 3D object. And you use this to add color and some sort of like custom texture. So in Photoshop, this is what this looks like. So I would rotate my character around until I got the angle and the perspective that I would want. And then I would render, I would piece it apart. I'd take all these faces, is what we would call this, on this 3D object. And I would go over and I'd paint it in Photoshop. And then I would go back to my 3D program and apply it as a material onto this character. Because when you UV map something, it understands that you have taken all of the faces on this character and you've aligned your photo or your image to these specific faces. And it creates a material for you. I'm not going to go to an in-depth description of how to use Maya, but that's all the overall gist. So when you drag the material onto this guy, it maps the texture or the image that you've created, the colors that you've created, right onto this character, and you can sort of preview it, rotate, and manipulate this guy with that, with that material on him, and see it update in your render view. And so I would use this to sort of prototype different characters, and so let me move this guy out of the way for a second. And so that's a hue, and here's a shade. So we'll render this real quick. Let's see if this is going to show up here. So I've got my shade. Hopefully it'll render. All right, let's select him, and then we're going to do a quick render. And there's a shade. So the shade, of course, is going to have a that sort of gray scale sort of values there. And so this was my character development. I'd start in a 3D program, I'd experiment with perspective and the angling of the camera to get the overall effect that I would want for my characters. And these wouldn't be painted yet, of course. I'd have to UV map them, get that UV map into Photoshop and experiment, sort of break it down into pieces and parts. Here's a different perspective. This is like a 3/4 view. This might be like a direct side view. And then here's my shade. So I would sort of break this down. And the reason that these are sort of segmented like this in the image is that you would want this to be all separate. So when you get into Unity, our game program, and I'm going to show you this in the second part, you would need to be able to break this down into different parts so they can animate. And I'm going to show you a little bit about like the character animation and what that process is about. But this is just the character creation. So I hope you enjoyed it. And let's go into character animation in Unity. Alright, so we're going to jump right into Unity, and I'm going to show you how these characters sort of evolve in this space through sort of piecing them together, and giving them animation, and then we'll get a little bit into particles to add some sort of combat effects. So this is what we call like my sprite sheet. This is what's set up for the engine itself to use each of these individual images as sort of references to the character. Each part you can animate. And so when you get into Unity and you have your character assembled, and already I've done some animations, and so I'm going to show you the idle animation of this character. And when I'm thinking about these animations, it's a little bit of experimenting. You almost have to be the character. And so I imagine myself as this kind of clunky geometric hue, and I kind of figure out how I'm weighted and what that might look like. So if I hit play, you'll notice there's a bit of a, the way that the character sort of lifts each of their arms and their sort of chest bobs and their head kind of gradually moves, right? And this takes a little bit of experimenting, and you begin to get a little bit more familiar with this process. And so I'm not going to do like an in-depth overview of how Unity animates and how these things work, but I do kind of want to show you the inside perspective here. So here we have the animation track, and we use this here. Let me full screen this for you. So we have the animation track, and each of these little diamonds here are key points. So for each part of my, again, so these are each of those sprites, right? Each of those, the head, the right arm, body, and I even have a little shadow. In Unity, you can actually animate each of these individually in the animation tool, which is really nice. You can have something that's really fluid very quickly, and this is a great way of working. There's another way to do this, and again, there's many ways actually that you can do this. This just happens to be the way that I chose because of time, and I'm trying to think about being somebody who's working a full-time job and doing this on the side as a personal project, and my friend who's doing a lot of the programming. I'm trying to do this in a timely manner, so what I did was made each of these individual images that can be animated, but you can also make what's called a sprite sheet. And if you're not familiar with a sprite sheet, we're going to do a little bit of Google here. Sorry, my little email going on there. So we're going to bring up a sprite sheet, and these might look very familiar, right? So this is almost the animation that I just showed you, but in sequence drawn out, right? And some artists really love this process and really love to illustrate this, and all more power to them. This just happened to be my process for building this character. So again, I would, if I were to open up the sprites or the sheet that I'm using for this character itself, let me take a look. Oh my goodness, we have so many things. I might not be able to easily find it because I'm not very organized right now. So let's take a look. Okay, so here's my sprite sheet. And if I were to go into this in Unity, I could open this up. And again, there's really interesting things that you can do with this. Now you can see that this character is repeated and has been colored in different ways. And this is just to get the idea out. We're in the very early stages, and so I'm just trying to get a sense of what these characters feel like. And you'll notice that here's my shade, and my shade animates in their own way as well. So they've got their own sort of animation. And again, that's their idle animation. And I can begin to show you some other animations here. If I go to my hues blue, I can switch over to attack. So we can see kind of what attack looks like. So here's my attack. So he kind of shoots his arm out to smack something. I can show you this in the actual gameplay. So we've got a little bit of gameplay here. Let's take a look. Let's go ahead and go to battle. Don't save. We're fine. Everything's going to be okay if we don't save. So we're going to load this up. It's going to take a second. And I'll hit play and see if this runs. See if my programmer's been... So here we go. This is the very simple battle sequence to test what these characters look like and how the actual mechanic of the game is working. So here we're attacking our shades. They're not really attacking anything yet. Oh, here they go. Okay, so these animations are really easy to sort of create when you have all of these things sort of pieced together like they are in that sprite sheet as individual images, instead of making a full-blown sprite sheet, which would take hours upon hours to try to create these animations as 2D images. So this works out really good. What you're seeing in addition to my characters throwing their arm out at the enemy, is you're seeing this particle system. In the next video, I'm going to show you a little bit about particles and how you use them to create really interesting effects. So thank you for watching the character development in Unity. Okay, so for the final part of this video, I'm going to be showing you guys particles and how I'm using particles to create combat effects and add a sort of really interesting nuance to the style of this game. So to get started, I'm going to sort of show you some custom-made ones that I played around with. I have some really crazy blasting particles. We got, let's see, well, what's this one do? Is this anything? No, this one's broken. We're just going to remove that one. We're going to pretend that didn't happen. We've got a beam. So here's a beam. And particles are really interesting. And this is kind of the really cool thing about building a game from the ground up, is that you get to experiment in all the different areas of what it is to create a sort of world, a style, effects. You get to experiment in all these different parts of game design and what it is to build a game and what goes into that. And you'll find yourself becoming really attached to a particular process, which is kind of what happened to me when I figured out that particles were really cool. So I just was like, I'm just gonna sit and do particles for 5 hours. And it's really interesting the sort of effects that you can get from just simply taking a little bit of time. And again, I'm just dragging these guys on here because I just want to show you how cool this stuff is. So if I want to hit play, I kind of want to see all these particles doing particle things. So here's, and these all have different purposes. And so the way that I start thinking about particles is you're trying to think about the effect you're going to get. Now, some of these particles are not being used in the game. These are just kind of almost like sketches. So I would sketch particles to figure out what their use is. So this blast here, this is like for that attack when he throws his arm or her arm, right? What particle is appropriate for that attack? Now, the particle that they have with their current attack, when their arm goes out and hits, it just has like a little bit of a trail, right? We create a particle trail. And so that's kind of neat. But we also needed, because this is kind of like you want your player to be able to click the screen, you need something that's abrupt and sort of immediate and shows a bit of a blast. So that's where this particle here, this sort of blasting particle, came into play. So I want to show you that animation. So I'm going to remove some of these particles that I added. I'm just going to remove some of these guys. And again, I'm going to create, we'll have a chance where I'll create a particle system, and I'll show you how you sort of navigate it. So one of my animations that begins to represent some of these, let me bring this guy up, and I'm going to show you what this looks like. And again, Unity has these amazing tools that allow you to sort of see what these animations look like as you're building them. So here's a different attack with that. Oh, geez, he's getting blasted with the blast over here. We're going to delete this. And so we're going to I want to show you how that other attack with that particle effect. Now, it's still a little clunky. It doesn't feel quite fluid enough yet to my judgment. But here's some particles, and this is showing just if you were to tap this character, what would that look like when they sort of hit the character and create the particle effect. So let's jump into what it is to make a particle effect. It's kind of neat. So if I go to create and I jump right into effects and then we create a particle system, here we go. This is my particle system. This is where we start. And you can do, so there's so many things you can do here. There's so many interesting things you can do. And so I have different sprites that I created in Photoshop that I use as my actual shape. So if I go to my renderer, I can choose from a variety of things. There's even free stuff. So Unity has what's called an asset store, and you can download free stuff. So I got this like over 100 like particles, like images that you can use for particles. So here's one that I have, and this is just something that I made. This is like triangles. It's nothing like really exciting, but so now I just replaced the shape with my triangles, which is pretty cool. And they're in a cone right now. They're kind of being emitted from this cone. You can also just have them emit in a straight line and not in a shape, but we're going to keep them in a cone because cones are cool. So this is going to run a little bit because it's simulating this right now, so it's going to kind of chug. My computer's going to not be happy with me. So I'm going to lower my max particles. You can even add some gravity to this. So if I want some gravity, I can add some gravity so they kind of like fall like water, like if it's a fountain, right? And I think we're blasting. So it's kind of like sequentially just doing that, which is kind of cool. And you can do a lot of different things to make it feel random. So lifetime is how long those particles last. So I can actually have this fluctuate between two constants, two numbers, right? So I could do maybe it lasts for 2 seconds up to maybe 10 seconds. So it sort of moves in between, so these kind of have a random effect, especially if it's like sparks, or maybe it's like a fire. You can add noise, which is kind of cool, which is great for fire, actually, because it gives it this like weird, wavy, and all of this stuff, and this is why Unity is fantastic, is you can modify all of it. So it's a really exciting tool. Let's say if I want to really, and sometimes I just, oh geez, okay, that went crazy. They're bees, bees! So you can really play around with some of these properties and get the effect that you want. And the beautiful thing about using these tools is that there's a immense amount of tutorials online, and that's kind of how I actually got a chance to make one of these guys. Where's my beam? I followed a tutorial of a gentleman who was making mage effects, like fireballs and ice balls and all kinds of cool stuff, and I absolutely loved his tutorial and created my own sort of effect. Now, we might not use this in the game, but dang is it cool, right? So this is particles, and we use particles to just get those little additional accents to make that game feel like, it makes it feel like a better experience. It's more immersive. There's things to always be looking at and experiencing, and that just adds an edge to your design. So this is the end of the character development section of the series. And the next one that I'll be going into for the next show, or when I've gotten further in development, is talking about world building. So I'm really excited to invite you guys in on this process. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me, or even just come up to my office and talk to me about the process for building games. I absolutely love it, and I loved making this video. So thank you for watching.